I hope all of you are doing good. This is Roshni from Learner Hub, the free learning platform where you can learn anything, anytime, from anywhere, absolutely for free at learnerhub.com. So today I am here with our environment class 10th science. Now, needless to say that this is a very important topic, not just for your school exams or board exams, but for life. Because environment is something without which we really cannot survive. So in this entire lesson, we will cover few important topics like ecosystem, types of ecosystems, different components of an ecosystem, and eventually we will cover this entire lesson in 6 videos. So are we all ready? Let's get started! So let us see what are we going to study in this lesson called our environment. Now, have you ever, I'm sure all of you are aware of the term environment. What does this part environ means? The term environ means around. So basically, what is environment? Now, everything that is surrounding us or everything that we see around us on which we depend for our sustenance is nothing but our environment. For example, when you look at this nature, what all do you see around yourself? For example, the greenery around us, the plants on which we depend for the oxygen which we breathe in or for the food which we eat, the other animals which live with us on this beautiful earth. So on them also we depend in one way or the other. So not only the living objects, also the non-living things. For example, water, air, soil. Do you think that we can live if we do not have even one of them? No, right? So all that surrounds us, all that helps us to live is nothing but our environment. So we can say that all that surrounds us is nothing but our environment. So in this lesson, we will see that how each one of us continuously interact with one or the other component of the environment. So when I say us, I'm not only talking about the human beings, I'm talking about each and every living organism existing in this environment. So everybody is dependent on each other. No one can exist in isolation. So here we will talk about the various components which actually form the environment. We will also see that how these days with the development, with each passing year, how our environment is being threatened by our activities, by the human activities, and what is the need that we should take care of this environment. So basically, first we will talk about what makes up the environment. What are the different components that form the environment? Wherein we will talk about ecosystem. So that is a new term for you, I'm sure, but just from the next slide onwards, we will talk about ecosystem in detail. So when we talk of environment is nothing but there are multiple ecosystems existing inside the environment. So when we study ecosystems, we will see how living organisms depend on each other for their survival, how living organisms depend upon the non-living things existing in the environment. Right? So the first part is studying ecosystem. The next part is studying the dependency between the living and the non-living organisms of the environment. And then towards the end of the lesson, we will see how these days our environment is getting threatened. I mean, what is the need that we should protect our environment? So how are we getting benefited from the environment and why should we protect the environment? So this is going to be our agenda in this lesson called our environment. I hope at least it gave you some idea about what you are going to study in this lesson. So let us start with ecosystem, because first of all we want to understand the various components which together form this environment. And when I talk about the components forming environment, it becomes very important to talk about ecosystem. Now again, it is made up of 2 words, eco and system. So let us see what exactly it is. All interacting living organisms in an area together with the non-living constituents of the environment form the ecosystem. That means living components plus the non-living components. So living organisms, I really don't need to give you examples of living organisms. Anything with all living beings, maybe animals, birds, insects, microorganisms, human beings, everything fall under living organisms. So these living organisms as well as the non-living constituents. And what are the non-living constituents we are talking about here? It would include anything like water, dissolved gases, air, soil. These are the non-living components. So how these living organisms and non-living organisms, they interact with each other and they form an ecosystem. So if you try to understand an ecosystem, I would like you to take the example of colonies. For example, you live in a city, say you live in Delhi. So inside Delhi, you will have small colonies, right? For example, you'll have a place called Preet Vihar, you'll have another place called Dilshad Garden. So you'll have different places, right? So you'll have different colonies. Now in each colony, there are many people who are living inside that colony. So inside that colony, people interact with each other and they live happily. They help each other in need. So inside each colony, people not only interact amongst themselves, they also interact with all living organisms in that locality. Right? So they interact with the living organisms as well as the non-living organisms. For example, in each locality, people say that we should plant more and more trees in our colony. Why? Because greenery is good. Why is it good? Because if there are more plants, so the plants will give out oxygen, so we can breathe in oxygen, so we'll get some fresh air around. Right? So for those reasons, we should plant more trees. So that means people of that locality are also interacting with the plants of that locality. They want the air of that locality to be fresh. So each such colony is nothing but an ecosystem. I mean, I'm just trying to give you an example, just to make you understand what an ecosystem is. Now I will give you actual example of ecosystem. A pond is an ecosystem. In this picture, you can see this pond, right? Now inside this pond, you have a variety of living organisms. For example, you will find fishes, you will find small fishes, big fishes, you will find animals like frogs, you will find small insects, you will also find a lot of plants inside the water. So these are the living components of the pond. When I talk about the non-living components, it would include water, right? It would also include soil. I mean, if you go deep down the pond, you will see that there is some soil at the lowest level of water. So you'll have soil, you have water, you have oxygen dissolved in water. And all these things, all these non-living components are extremely necessary for the aquatic life. Right? So we can say that pond is an ecosystem. That means pond is an area which consists of living organisms, which consists of non-living organisms, and they both depend on each other for their survival. So pond becomes an ecosystem. Right? So pond is just like a colony in your city. Right? Because pond is not the only ecosystem in the entire environment. There are other ecosystems as well. Let us look at another example. Forest. Right? Inside the forest, you have so many plants, full of plants and trees, right? So many trees. You have so many different varieties of animals, starting from big animals like lions, tigers, and elephants, to very small animals like small insects or birds. You even have non-living components like water, you have soil, you have hills, you have air. So these non-living components also exist. Now, do you think that if the non-living components are not there, the wildlife will exist in forest? No. Right? So pond, forest, ocean, these are all examples of ecosystems. Right? So I hope you are able to get some idea about what an ecosystem is. So when I talk of ocean, again, you have a variety of life inside the ocean. You have big fishes like whales, sharks, you have animals like crabs, shells, and the non-living component obviously exists there as water and soil. So each such ecosystem will have plenty of living and non-living components which will be constantly interacting with each other, right? So now in the next few slides we will see what are the different types of ecosystem that exist in our environment, how the living organisms in an ecosystem depend on each other. Why do they depend on each other? So we will study about all those things in the next few slides. So let us look at the types of ecosystems. Now, broadly, ecosystem is divided into two types. One is natural ecosystem and the other one is artificial ecosystem. Now, I'm sure just by looking at the names, you would have guessed what are they. So let us quickly see. So what is a natural ecosystem? Natural, that means something which exists in nature on its own. So we do not do anything to make it exist in nature. So natural ecosystem, self-established ecosystem in nature. That means the ecosystem established itself. Nobody created that ecosystem. It just happened on its own. So what are the examples of natural ecosystem? Can you guess? Right. You can think forest as a natural ecosystem. Do you think that human beings created forests? No. We can say that human beings try to spoil the forests. They have tried to cut down trees in the forests. They have tried to convert some of the forests into some other, they have used up the land of the forests for some other purposes, maybe for industrial purposes or for buildings and all. But the forest, they did not create forests. Forests were something which existed in nature on its own. So forest is an example of an ecosystem which is a natural ecosystem. Similarly, when we talk of rivers or ponds, they also exist on their own. So forest, rivers, ponds, they are all examples of natural ecosystem. On the other hand, when I talk of artificial ecosystem, artificial, the word artificial itself means something which has been created artificially. That means it was not existing on its own, but somebody made it exist. So ecosystems made and maintained by humans are called artificial ecosystems. So artificial ecosystems are the man-made ones. So which is created by human beings. So can you think of an example of an ecosystem which is created by human beings? So what is ecosystem? It is nothing but an area where living organisms live depending upon the non-living components of that area. I think if you try to think a bit on these lines, you will be able to think of artificial ecosystems on your own. No? Okay, let us look at the artificial ecosystems. Garden. In your house, you have a garden, right? So garden is an ecosystem on its own. You have so many plants there. So the plants live. So plants are the living parts of the garden. Whenever you have plants, you would have seen that small insects keep coming to your garden, right? The plants, they grow in your garden because they get water. They have soil. So soil, water, all these things form the non-living component of the garden ecosystem. And plants, small insects, small birds who come to your garden, they form the living components of the ecosystem. So garden, aquarium. So aquarium is again like, you can consider that aquarium as a small pond, artificially created pond, right? So aquarium, zoo, where we keep a variety of. Zoo is again an artificially created forest. It is not exactly like a forest. Here you generally have the animals inside cages, right? So these are some of the examples of ecosystem. Even in zoo, you have so many variety of animals, right? Those animals depend on the other animals present in the zoo for their food. Not only for food, they also depend on the other components of the zoo, like the temperature of the zoo, the air of the zoo, the soil of the zoo, the water present in the zoo. They depend on all these things for their survival. So artificial ecosystem would include garden, aquarium, zoo. Right? So basically these were the two types of ecosystem, natural and man-made. Now we will talk about the components of an ecosystem. What makes up an ecosystem? So by the definition which I taught you so far, what do you think from that what will make up an ecosystem? So in order to form an ecosystem, what are the basic things that you need? Firstly, it should have some living organisms. At the same time, if you want those living organisms to be alive, for that you need some non-living components as well, like water, air, soil, etc. So there are two basic components of an ecosystem. One is biotic components and the other one is abiotic component, right? So biotic, the word bio itself is related to life. So biotic components means the living components. Similarly, abiotic, that means something which is not live. So the non-living components fall under the category of abiotic components. So let us study about each of these components in detail. So biotic components, the living components of the ecosystem are termed as biotic components. When I say examples, you have so many examples, right? Now, when I talk about a particular ecosystem, for example, let me take examples from, say, for a forest ecosystem. So, in a forest ecosystem, what are the living components or what are the biotic components that you see? The various animals, the birds and the insects, right? So, you have a variety of birds, animals and insects inside a forest ecosystem. Let us now look at the abiotic components, that is the non-living components of an ecosystem. Non-living component would include components like soil, water and air. So you can see how critical these abiotic components are also, because we depend on these abiotic components. For example, air. What is air? Air consists of a mixture of gases, right? It consists of oxygen, which is present in 21%, nitrogen 78%, argon, carbon dioxide, and also some water vapor and dust particles. So these are all they all fall under abiotic components. But without them, we cannot think of breathing, right? So they are so very important for us. So you see how we are dependent on our environment. We depend on our environment for the food which we eat, because for the food also we depend on one or the other component of the environment. We depend on the environment for the air which we breathe in. We also depend on the environment for the water we drink. And without all these things, we will not be able to survive. Right? So this was about the abiotic components of an ecosystem. So now let us talk about the classification of the biotic components. Like as I said, when I talk about the biotic components, that is the living components of ecosystem. So the living organisms are vast. We really have a very, very vast variety of living organisms, starting from the minute microorganisms like bacteria, fungi, viruses, to the huge whales or elephants or lions or tigers. So there is a great variation. So we have a good variety of the aquatic life, aquatic plants and animals. Similarly, we have a hell lot variety of terrestrial animals as well as plants. So the biotic components were further classified. So the living organisms, that is the biotic components, are classified into 3 groups based on how they derive their food from environment. Because as I said, in this lesson, our focus is how organisms depend on each other for their survival. So when I talk of survival, food becomes a very important factor, because we know that none of us will be able to survive without food. Because food is something which actually provides us energy, and without energy we will not be able to do anything. Right? So now let us see. So we will see that there are many animals which derive their food in many different ways. So depending upon their way of obtaining food, they are broadly classified into 3 types. So what are they? Producers, consumers, and decomposers. So these are the 3 classifications. So we will now study about each of these type of living organisms in detail one by one. So let us see who are producers and who are consumers and who are decomposers. Now with the names, I am sure you are able to guess who are each of them. Producers are those who produce stuffs. Consumers are those who consume them. And decomposers are those which actually decompose things. That means which break down things. So let us see who are they. So let us start with producers. So these are the organisms which prepare their own food. That is why they are called producers, because they are the ones who are producing the food. So examples are the green plants and the blue-green algae. Needless to say that the green plants produce food by the method of photosynthesis. So we have discussed about the process of photosynthesis in detail in one of the previous lessons, I guess in the lesson on life processes. So there we have seen that how in presence of sunlight, the green plants will convert carbon dioxide and water into glucose, which is then stored inside the plants in the form of starch. So that starch actually acts as food for the plants. So by the process of photosynthesis, these green plants will be able to produce their own food. And similarly, blue-green algae, which are also known as cyanobacteria, as you can see in this picture, blue-green algae, they are also producers because they can also perform photosynthesis and prepare their own food. Let us now look at consumers. What are consumers? Organisms which depend on producers either directly or indirectly. So basically the term consumer means those who consume things, those who eat things. So producers are the ones who will produce food. Consumers are the one who will eat that food, right? So in a rough term. So consumers actually depend on the producers for food either directly or indirectly. So what do we mean by directly and indirectly? When I say that a consumer depends upon the producer directly, that means the consumer feeds consumer actually feed on the producer itself. For example, let us take the example of say goat. So goat, what is the food for goat? Plants. So goat directly feeds on plants. So we can say that goat is dependent on plant for its food directly because it is directly consuming plants. Now when I say depending on producers indirectly, what do I mean by indirect dependence? For example, let us consider lion. Now a goat feeds on the plants. But do you think that a lion feeds on plants? No. So what does a lion feed upon? A lion feeds on maybe goat or deer or other animals. Now these animals in turn feeds on plants. So if there are no plants, then lions will also not get food, because if there are no plants, goats will not get food. So there will be no goats. If there are no goats, so lion will also not get food. So even though lion is not directly depending on plants for food, but it is dependent on animals which eat plants. So we can say that lion is indirectly dependent on plants for its food. So these kind of organisms which depend on plants for their food either directly or indirectly are called consumers. So examples: animals, insects, birds, humans. For example, here you can see a tiger, a human being also. For example, many of us, we feed on plants as well. For example, the vegetarian people, they generally feed, or they eat fruits or vegetables, right? So they are directly dependent on plants. But there are some people who are non-vegetarian. That is, they feed, that is, they eat meat as well. They eat meat, they eat fish, and these organisms in turn depends upon plants. So even human beings are also consumers. That is, we also directly or indirectly depend on plants. Now, in these consumers, again, we have a variety of animals. So that is why a further classification was done, because as I said, here only you see that there are two things. Some animals will depend directly on plants, whereas some animals will depend indirectly. So based on the way animals are dependent on plants for their food, they were further classified into 4 types. The first type was herbivores, next carnivores, then omnivores, and finally parasites. So these are the 4 classifications of consumers. That is, these are the 4 types of consumers. So let us now discuss about each of these types in detail. So what are herbivores? Herbivores is derived from the word herb. Herb, what is herb? Herb is a small plant, right? So organisms which feed directly on producers, that is plants. So those organisms which are directly dependent on plants are called herbivores. Examples: goat, cow, buffalo, horse. So all these animals, they directly feed on plants. So that is why they are also consumers, but they are directly dependent on plants, so they are herbivores. The second one is carnivores. So I think you would have guessed it. So organisms which feed on herbivores. So the organisms, that means carnivores, are indirectly dependent on plants. So these organisms, examples would be lion, tiger. So see, any of the animals which you see above, like a lion or a tiger can eat up a cow, they can eat up a buffalo, they can eat up a goat, a deer. So they actually feed on the herbivores. So that is why they are carnivores. The third type is omnivores. What does the word omnivore means? Organisms which feed on both plants and animals. That means they will eat plants as well, and they will eat animals as well. Can you give me an example of an omnivore? Exactly. All of us, the human beings. Many of us are, however, herbivores. That is, there are many human beings who does not feed on anything else other than plants. So they are herbivores. But human beings in general, since inside human beings we have many who feed on flesh or who eat flesh. So that is why we consider that human beings are capable of eating both plants as well as animals. So they are termed as omnivores. So not only human beings, we have other animals also which are omnivores. For example, cat, rat, monkey. So they also feed upon both plants and animals. And the last one is the parasites. So what are parasites? So these are the organisms that live on or in another organism and derives food from that organism. We have spoken about parasites in detail in one of our lessons in class 9th. Why do we fall ill? If you remember. So what are these parasites? They live inside the body of some other organism and obtain its food from that organism. So think of an example. The tapeworms in human intestine. You would have heard very frequently that people get food poisoning happens to people. When you eat something outside, or when you eat something junk, something spicy, something which is not cooked properly. So your stomach tends to get upset. Your food is not digested properly. So some of the other problems happen. Sometimes there is some infection inside your stomach. Now, why does all these things happen? That's because sometimes there are other organisms which are residing in your intestine. For example, tapeworms are one of the most common examples. It is seen that inside the human intestine, the tapeworm makes its own house. So here you can see in the picture, there is a party going on inside your intestine and you are suffering, unfortunately, right? So these tapeworms, how do they survive? They survive by taking food from our body. So that means whatever amount of food which we eat, they snatch away a small portion of that food, and that is how they survive. Now, that doesn't mean that they do not harm our body. So when they are snatching away a portion of our food, that itself means that they are harming our body. However, although they harm the host, their intention is not to kill the host as they survive on host. So what is host? So here parasite is the organism which lives inside another organism, and host is the organism inside whose body that parasite is staying. For example, in this example, tapeworms are the parasites and the human intestine is the host. That is, the human being is the host. So now, even though they are snatching away food from our body, so in a way they are harming us, right? They are snatching away our nutrients. But they do not want us to die. Because if that human being dies, the worm will also, the tapeworm will also stop getting its food, and eventually the tapeworm will also die. So intentionally they do not want that the host should die, because they get their food from the host. However, because of their method of eating, they end up harming the host. So these are the 4 categories of consumers: herbivores, which directly depend on plants; carnivores, which depend on animals which feed on plants; omnivores, which eat both plants and animals; and parasites, which live inside another organism and obtain its food from that organism. Clear? Okay. So we talked about the 2 types, that is the producers and the consumers. Now what was the last type of the biotic component? It was decomposers. So what are decomposers? These are the organisms which feed on dead bodies of producers and consumers. What will happen when organisms die? So now their dead bodies, if there are no decomposers, what would happen? The dead bodies of animals, plants, microorganisms, so everything will keep on accumulating, right? So there will be no way that they will go somewhere. So there needs to be a method by which those dead bodies can be consumed. So that is why we have these organisms called decomposers. So they eat up the dead bodies of producers and consumers. So they eat dead and decomposed things, right? So decomposers play a very important role in the environment. Some of the examples of decomposers would include bacteria and fungi. Right, so these microorganisms, bacteria and fungi, they have the capability to break down the complex bodies of animals or plants into simpler and simpler substances. So this is how they obtain nutrition for themselves, and at the same time the body gets decomposed. Right? So these were the three categories of the biotic components of an ecosystem.
I hope you found this video useful. If you have a feedback or you want to share your experience with us, do let us know in the comment section, and I will see you all very soon with a new video, with a new topic. Till then, take care. Bye-bye.